Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 12th webinar for CIP's online conference for World Town Planning Day 2018. My name is Daniel, and I'm the coordinator of partnerships and outreach here at CIP, and I will be the moderator for today's session. First, I would like to acknowledge that while our membership is national, CIP's operations are located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people, and we appreciate the opportunity to work on this land. Secondly, I would like to take this time to thank our conference sponsor, the BMS Group. BMS is a global insurance broker with a broad range of insurance and reassurance expertise, and BMS is also CIP's national professional liability insurance broker. For more information, you can consult our website at www.bmsgroup.com. Without further delay, I now have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished presenter, Ed Peterson, who will be presenting the session entitled Tiny Towns, 21st Century Affordable Housing. I will now ask Ed to tell you a little bit more about himself. Ed.
Thanks, Daniel. I was introduced to tiny homes about 5 years ago, and what caught my interest was the fact that they were an affordable, economical form of housing. I watched the industry for a bit and initially thought I would get involved in the design and construction of tiny homes. But after a while, I realized that that part of the industry was really evolving. But what was still lacking was locations where you could live in a tiny home once you had one. So at that point, I formed the Tiny Town Association, and that's really our focus, is to make places where tiny homeowners can live legally. So without further background on myself, I'm going to jump right into this. Tiny towns, 21st century affordable housing. So we feel that tiny towns and tiny homes can address the issue of affordable housing. It's a issue that most municipalities are dealing with, and we've broken down the problem to 3 areas. Basically, demand. There's more demand than the existing supply of affordable homes or affordable housing. Costs for new builds continue to increase, and also there's a limited number of developers that are building affordable housing. So we came up with the solution that having a new housing option may be a way to address affordable housing needs. So the idea of the tiny home could address the demand issue by essentially tiny homes work well as a housing solution for singles couples, and I'll get into this a bit more in a minute, singles couples and single parent families. But the idea is that if tiny homes were available as a housing option, allowing people that are in traditional forms of affordable housing to move into them if it suits their living style, that could free up traditional housing for others that wouldn't fit into the tiny home demographic. So a new form of housing can address the demand problem. Next, taking a look at costs. Costs are continuing to rise for traditional builds. Land costs are going up, materials and construction costs. So a new form of housing could address those, and a tiny home specifically can address cost issues because they're the most affordable form of housing to build and operate. Developers is the third key thing because there are only so many developers that are building affordable housing. Trying to add new developers is a big task. So removing the developer as the sort of bottleneck in the affordable housing process means that essentially a lot more affordable housing can come online a lot faster. So taking a look at tiny homes as a potential way of addressing affordable housing, I wanted to take a look at the demographics of the tiny homeowner. So there are the three areas that we've identified where people live well in tiny homes. Basically, singles, which is 28% of the population, couples making up 26%, and single parent families making up 9%. So these three uh, types of homeowners make up almost 60%. Oh, hang on a second. They actually make up over 60% of the population, and therefore the number of as many of these people as we can move into tiny homes, we can again free up traditional forms of affordable housing for those that don't fit in, essentially families. So what we did is to get some idea of what kind of numbers, what kind of how many people this could apply to. We started and we took a look at the population, and we broke our population down by age group. Essentially, what we did is we pulled the newborn to 20-year-olds out of the population, and we started out with that as the potential group or segment of the population that would work well in tiny homes. Next, we broke that down by gender. We're going to take a look in a minute as to why, but this gave us a way of looking at and applying some of these future limits. And here it is. So when we broke down, once we had broken out the groups by gender, we're then able to apply some health-related stats to reduce our group or make it a little more realistic. So we started out by applying some disabilities and health issues. The disabilities were age-related, so applied mostly to the older group. And then we used hypertension as just a basic kind of disability or health related issue to apply to the rest of the population. And this gave us the ability to shrink our target market down based on a person's healthy ability to live on their own and or live tiny. Next, what we did is we looked at households. So here we actually applied our three target areas: singles, couples, and single parent families to the to our market segment, and identified that this or had this reduce the total of potential tiny homeowners by 37%. Next, what we did is we looked at the makeup of the actual households or householders, because we realized that looking at the potential or the number of people that may fit into a tiny home demographic, we realized that it was easier to look at renters as opposed to everybody. Renters being people, of course, that don't have a home of their own, so a tiny home would be a potential move up for them. Also, with the cost of traditional housing, there's that obstacle that many people face as renters making the move out of renting to traditional housing. So we felt that this was a real potential focus of the segment being renters. And when we removed the householders from the group, it came down another 37%. Next, we wanted to try and figure out how we could determine who the people that would want to live tiny in our tiny home are. And while we haven't got families, so they're obviously ones that would need a larger home, we also felt that probably income was a good indicator of a person's propensity to live tiny. So what we did is we looked at the income across our age groups and used an inverse formula. Basically, the thought being the more money a person earns, the less likely they are to want to live tiny. So once we applied and we called this our affluence factor. So once we applied this to it, another 49% of the group was removed. And this brought us down to our final market segment, or our final tiny home demographic. So basically, we ended up, of course, the largest group being first-time homeowners in the 20 to 34 age. Next is 35 to 54, and so on. And what we determined, so when we applied that to Canada, we saw that there could potentially be interest from over 2 million Canadians coast to coast to live tiny in the coming years. And also keep this figure in mind, 6.72%, because you can apply that to your local city municipality population and get an idea of what the demand is going to be or could be, or what the potential is to use tiny homes to address affordable housing in your particular city. So taking a look a little further at tiny homes, there's essentially two versions of tiny homes. One's on a foundation and the other's on wheels. The differences we have here are basically where they're built and how they're parked. The cities currently tend to lean towards tiny home on foundation as a tiny home format that they're first willing to embrace. And we feel that some of this goes back to the traditional form of housing, when something's built on a foundation and it gives people a way of identifying and really inspecting the home. Everything is in the know and sort of format. However, we'll see in a moment or two, there's some limitations to that. And I think the point we want to make here is really to realize that tiny homes on wheels also have a spot and some advantages to ones that on foundations don't. So there's temporary foundations would be similar to a mobile home type of a foundation, so which is basically stilts jacks or piers, lashing to ground anchors. Permanent foundations would be typical block or other form, and of course, and then pad, because tiny homes could exist on a pad foundation as well. And there's a movement towards a hybrid design in tiny homes on wheels. So essentially you can bring the home in, remove it from the trailer, and then place it on either a permanent, temporary, or a pad foundation. When I started the Tiny Town Association, and actually the reason for the Tiny Town Association name is because after a lot of conversations with people, and this was in some earlier years, there was a lot of hesitation to tiny homes within traditional housing residential neighborhoods. So I took that, and with my board of advisors, we talked about it and came up with the idea of the tiny town as a way of providing locations for tiny homes that are outside of the urban areas, and so would not be infringing on traditional housing. When I started talking to some of the municipalities and cities, however, there was to me anyway, there was a surprising interest in integrating tiny homes into the urban locations so that they could increase density. So sort of from that, we went back and we looked at the different ways that tiny homes could be integrated into the existing municipal structure. And this is what we came up with. So essentially, vacant land and building lots. Now, this is available already in a number of locations. Different cities do allow tiny homes on foundations to be constructed within their areas. It's also the fastest and most immediate solution um, for enabling tiny homes and increasing the amount of affordable housing available in a city, because the onus is really on the homeowner to develop the site to meet the requirements both of the city and of the tiny home. The next way, so that's vacant land or building lots. The next way we were looked at was infill. So infill is where you have a piece of property in a city that already has a dwelling on it, and then the land that the dwelling is on has enough space to accommodate a tiny home. And so in an infill program, that would allow a homeowner to rent out space to a tiny homeowner. Pocket communities are kind of interesting because they would provide a way of incorporating tiny homes onto either vacant building lots or property that's being repurposed. So it could be light industrial or some commercial space that's being repurposed and could be repurposed into tiny housing. And in a pocket community, you'd be looking at somewhere between, well, anywhere between 2 and more, typically 6 or 8 tiny homes on a lot, and that would be a pocket community. And then tiny towns, as you can see, it's the slowest to implement. There's a number of hurdles that, I have to say hurdles, but there's a number of applications that would need to be done to provide for a tiny town. However, the tiny town has a lot of opportunities that aren't available in any of the other location solutions, and we'll get to those in more detail shortly. So just looking at each solution a little more in depth. So vacant land building lot, well, this is the easiest to implement. It's and the easiest way to expand affordable housing in a location. It's not the most efficient use of land, and it's also or services. So basically, it's tiny homeowner built and managed. So a tiny homeowner, if the tiny home, like the one in the picture here, operates off grid, it's using solar, it generates, it's using composting toilet to manage waste, and and it is basically occupying that one piece of property. Other tiny homeowners will install septic systems, wells, and hook up to municipal hydro services if they're available. It's really up to the homeowner and the municipality how that's handled. One recommendation we have, and this is, I know, not really popular among tiny homeowners, but we think it's the fairest solution, is that the tax rate on a tiny home on a vacant land or building lot should be at the same rate as the minimum traditional sized home that would be built on that property. The reason being is, or at least we feel that the reason to suggest this is that from a tax-based perspective, if the tax collected on a building lot is below that, it doesn't really add to or complement the plan for the development of land. So not only that, but a tiny house on a building lot is taking up the space of what would otherwise be a traditional home that would generate a traditional tax based on its size. So this is why we're suggesting a minimum tax base for a tiny home on a lot, essentially the same as what you would get on a traditional home. Infill program. This is a program we like a lot. It provides a way of increasing the density in cities. And the nice thing is under the program, the cost for doing this would be borne by the homeowner. So as we have sort of planned it out, a homeowner would apply to the city to put in a tiny home site. And assuming that the property itself can accommodate a tiny home, they could get a permit to build the site. And the site would be built essentially to mobile home standards for the tiny home to connect to. The homeowner would run municipal services to the tiny home site. And essentially, what happens is when their site has been completed and approved, the homeowner would then apply for a 1-year permit for the site. And that permit would take the place of an additional tax on the home. This allows the tiny home and the traditional home to operate separately from a tax perspective, and it doesn't. And the really key thing here is it doesn't lock in having a tiny home on that site forever. So, as I mentioned earlier, tiny homes on wheels have benefits, and one of the benefits is that while it can provide permanent housing, it's not the same as dropping an apartment building on a piece of property. It's not permanent forever. So I could apply to get a permit to have a tiny home site or spot in the infill program in my backyard, and I could rent that out. And then when I sold my home, if the buyer didn't want to continue to offer that service, I guess is really what it is, to tiny homeowner, they could essentially kind of like having a pool that you buy in your house. If you don't want the pool, you can always fill it in. And similarly, if you don't want to have the tiny home site in the home you buy, you can remove it. And that's the advantage of the tiny home on wheels. It's not permanently located. And the structure or what has to be done to prepare the site is not irreversible. So where you have a tiny home that goes into somebody's backyard, maybe takes up where they had a vegetable garden at one time or a pool. And then if the next buyer or homeowner decides that they don't want to do that, they want to go back to the vegetable garden or pool, they can do that. The other reason for the annual permit is that we're suggesting that the cities determine whether or not a tiny home can go on a lot or on a residential lot without consideration of the neighbors. Now, again, this is probably the point of contention on this suggestion, but we felt that neighbors would probably have a negative reaction to a tiny home moving into their neighbor's backyard. And they're not basing their negative feeling based on experience. It's just on perception. So the thought is, if the city issues the building permit and then issues the tiny home occupancy permit, then, and because that only runs for a year, if a neighbor has an issue with a bad tiny home resident, they can put in a complaint on that tiny home owner and or the traditional homeowner with the tiny home site. That way, if it's a legitimate um, complaint, the city can then make two determinations: either um, not renew the permit or require that the changes be made. So that we felt was a better way of kind of policing the the tiny home site rather than beginning by trying to seek permission to include it. Pocket community. This is another great way of increasing density. The way we envision that the pocket community will work is that a co-op would own the property, they would develop it, and then they would either have co-op members live in their tiny homes on the property, or they would rent it out. And if the city is participating um, in the cooperative, to be able to have some social housing on the development or in the pocket community, this is another way that that this could work together. And again, this is a non-permanent solution. Although it's, I say it's non-permanent, the houses can be permanent. People can live in them for however long. But the thing is, the development of this land is not permanent and can be changed in the future. So, you know, this could be sold off at some time in the future, and pardon me, another single-family dwelling could go in here, or an apartment building could be built on it, or whatever. So there's the opportunity to repurpose the land without having to make drastic changes. So, and again, here the site is developed by the cooperative. Connections are to all the city services, and and our thought is that the co-op would be charged an annual fee per home, and that way the taxes would be again done through a fee as opposed to a flat rate or a square footage tax. So that's the pocket community solution. So just before I get into the tiny towns, you know, there are some fears with tiny homes, and basically from traditional home owners. You know, the fear is that tiny homes will negatively impact the value of their home without them realizing that a tiny home on wheels is not a permanent change. So, you know, they could be living in their home for the next 10 years, and a tiny home owner could be living in their neighbor's infill program for the next 10 years. And, you know, when the person wanted to sell their home, an arrangement could be made that maybe the tiny home wouldn't be renewed that year, giving the neighbor an opportunity to sell their home without that sort of quote unquote um, tiny home um, next door. The other thing is that, geez, I just throw this in. I mean, with tiny homes, they're new, and so they're weird. Not that they're really weird, but they're non-traditional. So they're things that people don't have experience with. Just a few years ago, we went through a lot of controversy over the renewable energy program in Ontario and Canada. And there was a lot of people up in arms with how ugly solar panels looked, and how bad for the environment windmills are, etc. And yet now, a few years later, the focus is not on that anymore. You can see solar panels on houses or commercial buildings, um, and even larger ones, and it's not something that's strange anymore. It's People have become accustomed to it. I really feel that the same thing will happen with tiny homes over time. I mean, Hollywood's kind of glorified the trailer park trash, or trailer trash sort of stereotype. And well, it's been maybe good from a movie sales point. It doesn't really give today's tiny home and tiny home owner the understanding. Today's tiny home owner is not moving into it as a last form of housing resort. Most tiny homeowners are moving into it because of a desire to live tiny and to enjoy a more minimalistic lifestyle, and to focus their uh, financial resources not into just a large mortgage initially. So perception and stereotyping is a big issue. Um, Another one is a challenge that the industry is facing is an interpretation of code and zoning bylaws, because tiny homes can be built today that meet, well, with the exception of a foundation for a tiny home on wheels, that meet all the building codes, and in a number of ways exceed the building codes. Some of the earlier ones were designed and built very um, well. They were built with lofts, and they were built with ladders, and so there's a number of issues that came up with the tiny home construction and design, but those aren't required. We're working on building a model home at this time, and it's a one-story tiny home, 270 square feet-ish, so it's 32 by 8.5 feet wide, 32 feet long. One bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, living room, dining room. Built to um, insulation code. It's R50 ceiling, R30 floor, R28, I think, with walls. So it's a very, and there's no ceiling limitations. In fact, it actually, like I said, is built to code. So building codes are not the big stumbling blocks here. It's really the zoning and uh, and the interpretation of the existing zoning. Not necessarily even just changing the zoning, but how the zoning is interpreted and where tiny homes can be. So solution number 4, tiny towns. Um, so our concept of the tiny town is that tiny towns are cooperatively owned. So they're not owned by an individual or a corporation, but they're owned by a cooperative of tiny home owners. Um, the the concept is, and I'm going to get into this a little more in detail, but um, essentially it's a site where multiple tiny home owners can live, because it's cooperatively built, owned, and managed. Um, the expectation is that the affordability of the towns and the town sites will be able to remain moving forward. Unlike individual or corporation owned a site, which over time may be sold to new owners that then have to raise rates so that they can cover the cost of acquisition. The plan we're working on is to have all the tiny towns cooperatively owned, and then the tiny homeowners would buy a share in that cooperative, and that would give them some privileges. We'll get into that in a minute too. But this model we felt was the best way of maintaining the affordability of the um, tiny town sites. Locations. So we're we're planning that a tiny town would be located on a paved road, on a 100-acre minimum site, and be 30 to 15 to 30 minutes from the host city. And we've identified 133 cities across Canada, and we base that on a population of 40,000 and more, with potentially multiple tiny towns in by the larger centers. So we face some challenges, of course, because there is no real zoning that, other than a mobile home park or a trailer park, that is close to a town, tiny town. Um, so we're looking at putting together a proposal that will allow us to build a town that's more than just a collection of tiny homes. Our plan is to have 10% of the space of the home, so 10 acres in each town, to be common use and green space, and then 52%, just over half of the space of the pod, which is our neighborhood, as green space again. So we come up with a couple of designs for the town pod. And a town pod is basically our neighborhood, if you will, component in the tiny town. And I'll show you the next design in just a second. But we worked to come up with a design that we felt was somewhat plug and play. So it would allow us to launch the town with a number of pods and then expand the town on a planned in a planned manner by adding pods. So basically the pods in the town is being planned to be off grid and sustainable. So we're working to design in the center of the pod here. You'll see this is like a community center, and the community center is specific for this pod. It has solar collection on the roof. There is power storage beneath. We use some geothermal to moderate the temperature in the community center. And there's community space that would basically allow residents in the 12 tiny homes to be able to get together um, as a group. Um, a tiny home, by its nature, is tiny, and therefore it relies on the surrounding space as living space. So, with our Canadian climates, we're limited to when we can get together basically outside. And so that's where we came up with the idea of the community center in each pod. Not only that, but we were struggling with trying to figure out how and where we could put solar collection and power storage. And we thought, well, this community center could be a multi-use area. So what we've done is we've come up with the idea of running services underneath each pod, and in such a way that we can connect pods together and run the services from pod to pod, with the plan to develop a smart grid for the town that would allow each pod to operate independently but also share resources across the grid. Um, our plan is to use an anaerobic digester to process waste and organics in the town, and uh, the gas that we would collect, the renewable natural gas, would be used to fuel generators and also the tiny homes. This is our second pod design, and this is just has mainly two sides access and connections, and more designed to be the end of a pod row, if you will, or a neighborhood row. The pods are designed like around the outside there. That's a single vehicle lane. And the thought is as the community grows and pods are added, that increases the amount of traffic the pods can handle from by doubling up the roads on the active sides. So here's a little bit about our plan, long-term plan for tiny towns. So today we have the ability to really build a whole smart town from the ground up. But retrofitting our existing cities is a big process. So the thought was, well, if we build a tiny town, why not build it using the latest and best technology today? Well, similar to the way our cities were built when they were started many years ago, and build a smart town. So on the 100-acre site, we're planning for a maximum of 100 or 1,080 tiny homes. That's 12 per acre on 90 acres. And our launch plan is to include 120 sites and include 20 of those as ARDO program sites. Now, ARDO stands for Affordable Rent to Own Program, something we expect out that a host city can use for people that are on social assisted housing. Our program, and it's on the association website, but our program is it's a transition program. So it's designed to move people from socially assisted housing to being independent homeowners. As I mentioned, we're looking to use a digester to process the waste and organics, producing renewable natural gas for a backup generator, and also to supply back into the town for gas appliances. We plan 96 solar panels per pod, battery storage underneath, and it's connected to the smart grid. We're looking to hopefully include some sustainable in-town farming. And an interesting point that was brought up at another seminar I gave was, how would we manage, would we have to create a whole new set of bylaws for the tiny town? So in other words, the poop and scoop is a good, simple one, and that might have even been the example in the discussion. How are we going to have to rewrite that for our tiny town and then enforce it and everything? And what was pointed out to me afterwards was that, no, we're still in the municipality that we're in, and therefore all the municipality bylaws are going to apply to our tiny town as well. So everything as it is within the greater municipality is going to be the same within the tiny town. So that was the way that we identified how we would address those things. We'd still, of course, need support of the EMS and police in the tiny town, just as another community outside of the main city. So in other words, like another hamlet. So that kind of covers our stats. Town operations. So as I mentioned earlier, the towns are part of a network that's owned by a cooperative. So, and the cooperative being a not-for-profit organization. The tiny homeowners can become co-op members. So this is kind of getting into the details about how we envision the tiny towns will operate and exist and actually even start. So as a cooperative member, we've identified there's a few things they get to enjoy. First of all, they have a reduced site rental cost. they have stable home location, and they can relocate from town to town. We're looking at, like I said, 133 towns. So the concept is that somebody that is a co-op member has a tiny home. They can live in the tiny town that's outside of Hamilton, and then if they wanted to, they could relocate. They get a different job or whatever, and they need to relocate to Vancouver, so they could move to the tiny town outside of Vancouver. All that would be planned and arranged online, and they would just be able to book their new site and move. As far as stability goes, cooperative members have the stability of keeping their site for as long as they want to be on it. As opposed to non-co-op members could rent sites, but they'd only be able to rent sites that were available after co-op members had selected their sites. To kind of look at the scenario, if in our example, our Hamilton co-op member decided they wanted to relocate to Vancouver, and there was 1,079 co-op members living in sites and only one non-member renting a site. Non-member would be asked to relocate to make room for the member. So that's the sort of the idea of stability, and I guess that's the membership has its privileges, or really what it is membership has helped build the tiny towns, and so members are getting that preferred status. So site fees are planned to include site rental and utilities. We've projected costs for members at $250 a month, and then non-members at $500. The plan is to have the site rental fees remain affordable to support the affordability of tiny homes now and moving into the future. And again, this comes back to why we chose the co-op model, because rather than a company or corporation needing to show a profit, the cooperative needs to be able to operate. And so that's where we're hoping that this will help keep these fees to a minimum long term. So essentially, a member buys a share in the co-op, and they then, when they choose to leave the co-op, so similar to a housing co-op, they would sell their share back to the co-op, who would then sell it to another co-op member, and this would then allow a member to move in and out of the co-op as they as required. In other words, as an example, if somebody's using a tiny home as a stepping stone into traditional housing and having a family, so they buy into the co-op, they live in their tiny home for a number of years while they're building up their savings and can make the next move to begin a family in traditional housing. So share costs we've pegged at present at $25,000 a share, and those funds will be used to pay out the mortgage that the co-op will require to build the town structure. We plan that 10% of the monthly site rental fee will go to tiny taxes, and they'll go to the host municipality. They're collected, well, because they are a portion of the site rental fee, they'll be collected by the co-op, electronically paid out to the city monthly, and the co-op will be able to report on the site rentals as well to the municipality. We're also planning to have a member renter rating system. This is kind of our way of identifying the quality of the member and the renter within the system. We felt we needed a way to um, determine how well a person, a tiny home owner, fit into the community of the tiny town. And the rating system we felt was a simple way that basically we can develop a sort of a member or renter profile and determine whether or not the member or renter can continue on within the town structure over time. So just some summary notes here. Um, Tiny towns. So we feel that tiny homes will become a new affordable housing option. And regardless of whether they're embraced by every municipality, city, town, or hamlet, um, only because they make sense for some of the population. And there already is a strong movement to embrace it, even though the legal places to live tiny are limited. Um, so this suggests that it's more than a fad. It's a change that's coming, and we feel that the sooner locations embrace the tiny town or the tiny home uh, housing option, the sooner they'll be able to um, benefit from having that segment of the population look to them as places to live. Um, as a point three here says, young people are just beginning their careers, don't own a home, so they're the renters. Um, they're having a very hard time affording a home in today's market. Um, there's I guess three ways for new people to afford a home. One is the housing market crashes, which forces prices down to the point where new homeowners can afford to get into the housing market. Um, that's the first option, and definitely not one that's looked forward to by any homeowner. The second is that wages increase dramatically so that people can afford, first-time homeowners can afford to move into home ownership. Some of the stats that weren't included earlier are the number of people that are living beyond the 30% um, housing cost housing cost to income ratio, and how that is actually growing at an alarming rate. So the second way of ensuring that people can become homeowners is to raise wages. Of course, businesses and probably society, the economy can't manage that, because that will just result in, of course, all the things that a huge jump in wages would result in. So the third way is to create a new housing option that's affordable, and tiny homes fit that um, fit that requirement to a T. That they're a great starter home for young couples. They're a great retirement home for empty nesters. And that's another thing to consider is if a city doesn't include a tiny home plan, then people that want to live, or, well, we'll just say that people that want to live in tiny homes are going to look in other cities to live in. Um, Short term effect, no big deal. Long term effect, well, all those young people that have not chosen to live in a non supportive city are now in another city So they're the up and coming professionals, the leaders of tomorrow. They are the people that each city needs to move into or stay in the city to support the city and also to support traditional housing, because they're the people that are going to be moving into the existing traditional housing as the current owners become empty nesters and move out. So tiny homes have the potential to maintain that source of new buyers for existing traditional homeowners. Also, when you look at the retirees, empty nesters, those are typically people that have financial resources. So those that choose to live tiny aren't doing so necessarily because of financial needs, but they're doing it for a lifestyle choice. I mean, heck, cleaning a tiny home end to end in 3.5 minutes definitely beats what it takes to do a 2,000 square foot home. So, as an example, or more. I mean, there's 2,000 square foot isn't even a big home anymore. So there's that advantage from an empty nester. There's also the fact that an empty nester could own potentially multiple tiny homes in multiple locations and move to their tiny home when um, for the season potentially. So not offering a tiny home solution in a city means that those people are, if they are choosing to live tiny, are going to look elsewhere. So that's that 6.72% statistic I mentioned earlier to keep in mind. Because when you're looking at the effect that tiny homes can potentially have in your city, just multiply your city population by that number and see the impact that tiny homes may have in your future. Um, Tiny homes are a solution with options. And simply put, they can provide permanent housing, but they don't permanently change the landscape to accommodate them, which means the sites can be repurposed later as the city needs. Um, and finally, tiny homes are really an affordable housing option that's available today, can be implemented quickly, and can also be used to address social housing programs.
Perfect. So I'd like to thank you very much, Ed, for your very insightful presentation, and thank you everyone for watching. If you'd like to find out more about tiny homes or for more information, please feel free to consult Ed's website at www.tinytownassociation.com. So have a great afternoon, everyone.